Spider-Man has had a lot of cartoons over the years, and oh boy, do I mean a lot. Everyone, of course, has their favourites, but no matter which one you love, each has their fair share of dark moments within them. Spider-Man, of course, is one of the all-time great sad sack superheroes, and as such, any good adaptation of the source material is going to have some dire moments to make Spidey nice and upset. So, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 darkest animated Spider-Man moments. Number 10, Harry Osborn is the Green Goblin. Spectacular Spider-Man. By now, we all know how the Green Goblin story plays out. First, it's Norman Osborn, and then it's Harry who inherits the mantle after his dad dies in a fight with Spidey. So, when the Green Goblin showed up in Greg Weisman's Spectacular Spider-Man, we were all prepared for that being where everything was going. But the first rule of animated television is, and always has been, never assume you're one step ahead of Greg Weisman. Leading up to the big reveal, we see Harry grow more and more confident and socially popular through a strange green substance that he wolfs down like Tic Tacs. This, of course, is the Goblin formula, and we see it all come together as Spidey unmasks the Green Goblin, convinced it's Norman, only to find out that Harry is under the mask, to the shock and horror of both him and Harry's father. Seeing Harry thoroughly messed up long before Norman becomes the Goblin, let alone dies, was a shocking moment for anyone watching, especially kids who had only then seen the recent Raimi movies and thought they knew how this was supposed to go. Number 9, Venom dies a hero, Spider-Man the Animated Series. Although he's had something of a rebranding in recent years, throughout the 90s and 2000s cartoons, Venom was nothing less than one of the worst villains Spider-Man had ever faced. And by worst, I of course mean the most evil. He was monstrous, petty, and thoroughly deluded. However, never let it be said that the 90s animated series wasn't willing to call fair and give Eddie Brock one last shot at redemption. During an episode where Carnage and Dormammu, of all characters, teamed up to take out Spidey, Spider-Man, Iron Man, and Venom in turn teamed up to take the duo down. When all was said and done, Eddie Brock elected to sacrifice himself to save the world by throwing himself into a portal to God only knows where. It was one of the first times people had been made to witness the deeper layers of Venom, which the comics had been introducing at around the same time. But its appearance in the animated series for a much wider audience made it feel all that much more impactful. So, the last time we see Venom, one of the major characters of the entire series, he's falling into an inky black abyss from which there is no return, which is a pretty metal way for a character to bite it. Number 8, Spider-Man almost kills Shocker, Spider-Man the Animated Series. Now this scene lives in infamy for many reasons, but watched in context, what's so often used as a gag instead becomes rather harrowing. I say rather harrowing because oh boy, there are still some pretty weird line reads in there, but we still maintain that this is pretty dark for this era of Marvel television. This scene takes place during the 94 series' rendition of the Black Suit storyline, when the symbiote really starts to hook its claws into Peter's psyche and twist him to its point of view. So, of course, the first supervillain dumb enough to try and mess with Spidey in this state was gonna get the business. And it should come as no surprise that Shocker, of all people, is the one dumb enough. Even taking into account the hammy acting though, this scene is still harrowing for a kid's show from the 90s, as Shocker flees in abject terror from Spider-Man while the wall crawler chases him up a bell tower with every intention of taking the villain's life. The guy didn't even really do anything that bad, it was just showing how off his rocker Spider-Man was at that point. Number 7, Wilson Fisk's father leaves him to rot, Spider-Man the Animated Series. The Kingpin needs no introduction, but when you get one, it's almost always not a very fun time. The backstory of Wilson Fisk has always been a constantly changing thing that varies depending on adaptation and iteration, since the Kingpin didn't even have a real name until Frank Miller came up with one. While his backstory in Daredevil is still unrivaled though, the Spider-Man the Animated Series one does come close. Here, Wilson Fisk's path in the 1994 series was practically set in stone the minute he showed up, what with having the unfortunate luck of having a father like Richard Fisk. Wilson followed in his father's footsteps when he became a man, turning into a career criminal working for his father's organization. But if you expected any of that to translate into loyalty to his own son on Richard's part, then, well, I guess you must be new here. The first time Wilson got sent to jail, his own father cut his ass loose and left him to rot in prison. Despite knowing what he would go on to become, it's still heartbreaking all the same, as you know that it's this moment that truly sets Wilson on the path to becoming the Kingpin. Number 6, Mark Allen becomes Molten Man, Spectacular Spider-Man. Spectacular Spider-Man was always very good at making sure you knew the villains long before they had any powers. Just as we see Otto Octavius as the snivelling sidekick to Osborn long before he turns into the confident, bad-as-I-wanna-be Doc Ock, we first meet Mark Allen as the gambling addict older brother to Peter's friend Liz before the Green Goblin comes along to ruin his life forever by turning him into Molten Man. Either as part of one of his many long-play schemes or just to have a laugh on the afternoon, it's honestly hard to tell with this version of Old Gobby, the Green Goblin manipulates Mark into turning himself into sentient lava in order to clear his many gambling debts. And then to add icing onto the very hot cake, Goblin drives it into Mark that he owns the kid now by showing that only he has the ability to turn the powers on or off. It's a genuinely intense scene as Mark begs and pleads with the Green Goblin not to press the button, only for Goblin to do it out of sheer sadistic spite, making it utterly clear to the poor guy that he's a slave now and the Goblin holds the leash. Number 5, Eddie Brock's Joyride, Spectacular Spider-Man. One of Spectacular Spider-Man's claims to fame was how complex it made the character of Eddie Brock. Turning him from a random loser into Peter's childhood friend was a stroke of genius, since it made his fall to outright villainy all the more intense and tragic. The first glimpse we got at the bitter, angry creature lurking beneath the easygoing jock, though, was when he takes Mary Jane on a, well, shall we say, eventful motorcycle ride. Mary Jane here has latched onto Eddie Brock, but soon finds out just how over the edge this guy has become as he begins speeding through traffic, nearly crashing the motorcycle and/or killing innocent people at multiple points, all the while talking about Peter in an ever-increasingly unhinged manner. It's another truly suspenseful scene as it's made clear to both the audience and to poor Mary Jane that she's stuck with a maniac. Fortunately, in the end, no one is hurt, and Mary Jane tells the loser just where he can stick his motorcycle helmet, but still, the viewer is left uncomfortable at this one likable character being transformed into a jerk right before their eyes. Number 4, Harry's Declining Mind, Spider-Man, the Animated Series. The 90s Spider-Man animated series had a much more traditional interpretation of the Green Goblin saga than later interpretations for obvious reasons. This included a traditional fall for Harry Osborn, though the 90s show still lets us into his head way more than the comics did. While not the most complex fall in animation history, it's still pretty haunting to see Harry's mental state just flat out collapse, to the point where he's haunted by the spectre of his father in the Green Goblin mask, goading him into continuing his work. It doesn't even take that much to get Harry to do it, seeing as how the dude's been running on empty for a while at that point, but still, knowing that he's that far gone when we've spent entire seasons with him and Peter is nothing short of dark as hell. Number 3, Eddie Brock becomes Venom, Spectacular Spider-Man. The tragic culmination of Eddie Brock's downward spiral on this list is the moment where he becomes Venom in Spectacular Spider-Man. This was definitely a standout moment in the show's short run. Upon returning to Dr. Connor's lab, Eddie finds Spidey returning the symbiote to the observation chamber it was originally kept in, and then he destroys it. Eddie and Connor's plans for the lab's improvement effectively dashed, Eddie screams at Spider-Man as he leaves, only to discover that a bit of the symbiote did indeed survive. It then latches onto Eddie and shares a little secret that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Realizing that he doesn't have two enemies, he just has one, Eddie accepts the symbiote into himself and transforms into Venom, declaring all-out war on Peter Parker and swearing to get revenge for Peter constantly messing with his life. It's a haunting scene that demonstrates the show's main theme, Peter's civilian life being screwed over at every turn by his superhero one. Eddie used to be his best friend in the world, and now he's his worst enemy. Number 2, Peter Parker quits being Spider-Man, Spider-Man the New Animated Series. Now you might have noticed that there are exactly 2 Spider-Man shows on this list so far, and that's because by and large, well, they're the best ones. But still, did the otherwise mediocre New Animated Series that aired on MTV in the early 2000s know how to go out with a bang? Choosing to go out on a Hail Mary attempt to tease a second season that would never come, New Animated had its first season end on the darkest possible note, with Peter becoming completely disillusioned with being Spider-Man and hanging up the suit once and for all. Not to mention Mary Jane and the rest of the city being more than happy to see Spidey go after he seemingly threw show original character Indy off the side of a building. It's a somber as hell ending, with Peter marking the end of the show by throwing a suitcase containing the Spider-Man suit off the end of a pier, where it sank to the bottom of the ocean. And that's how the show left it for good, just on this really dark, really somber note. Number 1, Hydro Mary Jane Evaporates, Spider-Man the Animated Series. As you can tell from this list, even when Spider-Man shows go dark, they don't go incredibly dark. They don't want to give anyone nightmares. They typically try to keep the upbeat tone that the franchise is known for, but the 90s show has all the rest beat for dark moments for how it chose to do away with Mary Jane. The Spider-Man cartoon tried to follow the path of the comics as much as possible, including the franchise's hatred of Peter Parker being married. So when the hammer came down on Mary Jane, the way they decided to do it was nothing short of haunting. In this story, it turns out that the real Mary Jane was missing and quite possibly dead, while the one Peter married and had been having a life with was a clone created by Hydro Man, a clone that then proceeds to break down shortly after this revelation. Spider-Man can only scream at the top of his lungs for his wife to stay with him before Mary Jane is taken away from him forever. And yeah, it is really forever as well, because the show ended shortly after this, meaning that for an entire generation of Spidey fans who didn't read the comics, this was how the story of Peter and Mary Jane just ended. And yeah, big yikes on that one. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. What did you think about these moments, and are there any darker ones I missed off here? While you're down there as well, could you please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to What Culture Comics for more lists like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.